Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
We really appreciate, obviously, all the people I've got here on our live Zoom call. Per usual, great conversations and a lot of good input from our particular group, but we're expanding it in order to talk about this idea of theology without walls. So we really appreciate those of you who are watching this via a recording. I'll pull that up a little bit, make myself at home a little better. So theology without walls.
Excuse me. Sorry, Doug. For some reason, I was connecting with my connection, and I went back into your link, and then I got you in. Sorry. Let me give you the power for the recording.
So theology without walls. It was actually in 2015 that Danae and I went to San Antonio, Texas, for the American Academy of Religion. They meet yearly. They typically have somewhere around 10,000 people that show up for that, theologians from all over the world. In fact, on the plane over to San Antonio, the lady sitting next to me was flying in from Israel, and she was a scholar in the field of Old Testament prophets and was coming to be part of her group. So there are literally, I don't know how many, 100 or so breakout groups that meet, and you can pick a group to go do specialized study, and one of the groups is headed up by Dr. Jerry Martin, and his initiative is investigating theology without walls. So first of all, let me just give a little background here. I've got Jerry's bio. I want to make sure we give him credit for this wonderful job that he's doing to bring this conversation to the forefront. Jerry Martin has served as chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities and of the Philosophy Department at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has taught at Georgetown University and the Catholic University of America. He has published on issues in epistemology, philosophy of mind, phenomenology, trans-religious theology, and public policy. In 2014, he founded the Theology Without Walls project, which meets with the American Academy of Religion. Jerry is author of the book entitled God, an Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher. So, Jerry Martin, we really appreciate the fact that you started this project of a theology without walls. From the President's point of view, we have been pushing the envelope beyond the boundaries that have defined our understanding of God over the last 2,000 years. And one of the first things that came to mind when I read this idea of theology without walls was when Paul wrote to the group in Ephesus. And it was in chapter 2, verse 14, he was talking about the work of Jesus in relation to the Jews and the Gentiles. And Paul said that Jesus tore down the wall of hostility, thus making one new group, one new humanity. These walls of hostility and moving beyond walls are always going to be identity issues. So, for example, the wall between Jew and Gentile was very much an identity issue. And when we have walls between us, when I see you as other, that sets up the potential for less than, more than thinking within our minds. And it's pretty obvious that we have been growing in our understanding of our study of theology about a bigger and more inclusive God who is all in all, not all in some, which means that we're talking about identities, human identities determined by God that are universal in nature. But this is a real challenge. And I want to say, in reading the book, Theology Without Walls, that I appreciate the fact that many of the contributors to this book are professors and teachers at seminaries, and they are, in fact, Christian theologians. And the reason I want to thank all of them for engaging in this conversation is because some of the things that we're going to present are going to be radical and are going to be challenging to the particular viewpoints that they currently have, but are willing to wrestle with how in the world do we get to a theology without walls? How do we do this? And as I read through the book, you could see that they were really groping to do that. So what I want to start out with is this. I want to read some direct quotes, first from Jerry Martin, about what he's saying they're trying to do and what Theology Without Walls is. So I want to start with that and share on the screen, if I can here. I want to go ahead and start with some of these quotes from Jerry. I think you'll find this just really intriguing. So we have Jerry Martin, who I've already introduced, and he is with this project, founder of the project. And let's just look at some of his quotes here. Jerry asks this question: is Theology Without Walls a form of comparative theology? Yes, if, this is a big if it is understood as a comparative theology without walls. But it is an alternative to those forms of comparative theology that are essentially confessional, meaning attached to a religion, seeking to enhance one's theology by studying another tradition. So Jerry is saying, this is not just one religion studying and trying to learn about another religion and therefore do a comparison between my religion and your religion. We want to get beyond the walls that separate those religions. So you can see right away, this is a real challenge. So he says, is TWW, Theology Without Walls, a form of religious pluralism? No. Pluralism is a concept within confessional theology of religions. Again, this term confessional theology of religions is talking about the religion with which one identifies. Now, pluralism, when theologians are talking about pluralism, they're generally talking about the relationship of Buddhism and Christianity, Buddhism and Hinduism, or Taoism, Confucianism, etc., etc. And so this is for the theologian a way of saying, can we have not just respect for, but can we find in other religions truth, just as we have found truth in what we might call our home religion? But I would take this step further and say that just within Christianity, which is our field of study, we're talking about a trans-religious approach to theology, which will take us to a post-Christian place. That pluralism within Christianity is rampant from a denominational standpoint, that you have a pluralistic array of literally who knows how many different denominations that are out there. So anyway, Jerry is saying, hey, look, we're going beyond pluralism. Then he says, is the aim to find what is common among all major religions? No. The aim is to understand what is truly ultimate. Now, for those of us that are coming from a systematic theology related to the biblical narrative, that which is truly ultimate is God. In the beginning, God. It is God revealing his, her, its nature as all in all. So God is the aim of this narrative. And the aim of the narrative, as we are going to go through this session on Theology Without Walls, is to both reveal what is truly ultimate, this God that's being revealed, and what's my relationship to this ultimacy. And then further, as we go down the line in future weeks, I'm going to address ultimacy as it relates to other narratives from other people in other parts of the world, and have some fun with that conversation. Robert Cummings Neville helped Jerry Martin in the introduction to this book, Theology Without Walls. And Robert Cummings Neville is one of the foremost authorities on world religions. Is very much involved at Boston University and is well known for his acumen in Confucianism and Taoism and Eastern religions, as well as coming from the religion of Christianity. So when he weighed in with Jerry Martin on this, what is Theology Without Walls and what are we all going to be talking about? He said, Theology Without Walls will not be recognized as legitimate theology by people who think theology is always based within some faith community. It will also not be recognized by philosophers who do not like theology because they think it is always apologetic for some faith community. So here we see the walls that are existing between religions. And I would go back into what we've inherited through 2,000 years of Christianity, and that is that the walls of denominationalism have been just as high, if you will. And that the reason why Theology Without Walls won't be recognized is because whatever religion a person comes from, one of the first responses is, why in the world do I need to know anything about somebody else's religion? Why in the world do I care what a Buddhist or a Hindu or someone in the Tao thinks? And the same again can be true is, if I'm a Southern Baptist, why do I care what a Jehovah's Witness says? And I could take that times 1,000 denominations. Likewise, philosophers don't like it because they're thinking somebody is always using their narrative to defend and prove that their particular faith community is the representation in and of themselves of ultimacy. So these are the problems they're trying to get through, and this is not an unusual thing. So in the book Theology Without Walls, real interesting here, Jerry Martin talks about Christopher Denny, who is a professor, a Catholic professor at a university, teaching kids there at the university. And Christopher Denny had a student. Denny relays this story in the book. He had a student named Derek, who Christopher Denny said he wasn't the best student in the class. As a matter of fact, you'd often find him in the back of the room with his feet up on a chair, not really commenting a lot, until one day Christopher Denny was challenging the class, and he said, really, shouldn't or should religion be something that's kind of like a buffet, kind of like a smorgasbord where you could take some of this and take some of that and take some of this? And Christopher Denny was thinking that his class in this university, this Catholic university, would say, no, it's not like that. There's the right way, and there's the right religion, and there's the right interpretation and so forth. But it was Derek who spoke up and said, look, people are going to choose to do whatever it is basically that makes meaning in their lives. And that means that you might draw from any and all religions. And to Christopher Denny's surprise, the class jumped all over it, did the opposite of what he thought was going to happen. And the whole point was that when you're talking about religions, a human agent is making the choice. The great religious traditions are in large part the result of choices. I'm going to talk about this with regard to the biblical narrative, because when you are talking about attaching to a religion, that is something that is absolutely a choice a person makes. And I've used the example before. If you go to the waiting room in a hospital and you're there for the birth of a child, the nurse will not come running out and announce it's a Christian. What will happen is, with regard to Christianity, at some point a choice is made by a human agent. Now, that's completely different than thinking in terms of being and my innate God image and my innate breath of God within. And rather than making a choice of being, I am being. And we're going to talk about that and what Jesus and the apostolic writers were trying to get at, because when you are in a dualistic mode of obedient, disobedient, faithful, unfaithful, true believer, etc., human beings are making choices, human beings are making judgments, and human beings are decided who's in and who's out. So we're going to talk about that in more detail. Martin makes this point in regards to Christopher Denny's story. Martin says, and I love this, unlike relativism, theology without walls need not concede that all religious preferences are equal in existential value or soteriological efficacy. So Martin is saying, look, we're going to pursue theology without walls. We're going to look at a wide variety of people who are saying certain things about that which they declare to be ultimate. In the case of the biblical narrative, that which we declare to be ultimate is God. But Jerry goes on to say, in fact, the recognition of preferences and choices provides theology with a new starting place from which to engage the bewildering array of religious options available to us as we push our existential shopping carts down the aisles of reality. So, in this sense, we will be looking at our models from integral theory here in a minute, and I'll be talking about this idea of relativism in relation to us all pursuing a theology without walls. If the aim of theology is to understand ultimate or divine reality as fully as possible, and if evidence about and insight into that reality is not limited to a single tradition, then what is needed is a theology without walls, without confessional boundaries, meaning without an attachment to a denomination, a religion, without blinders, as it were. Hey, that's a pretty heavy-duty task that these theologians are taking on, because, again, in this book, Theology Without Walls, we have Dr. Paul Knitter talking about, if not for Buddha, I could not be a Christian. We have Dr. Jeff Long talking about Hinduism and ultimacy. And we have, again, as I said before, a number of Christian theologians who are meeting. Now, this is conversation that's happening now, and they're meeting every year, and they're talking about how can we get past the boundaries of our religion, because all religions are forms. They must be a form in order to distinguish themselves from others who are also forms. And what is a form? A form requires boundaries. A form requires, in essence, walls. in order to define that which is within the form versus that which is outside of the form. And so when you're talking, Jerry Martin says, about ultimacy or divine reality, and if that ultimacy is all in all, then it surely can't be limited to a single tradition. And part of what I want to do with you all is set the foundation today and go through theology next week, especially our Theology Without Walls. But in the process of this, I want to have a session where I hear from each of you that are live with me on this Zoom call. And if you're watching this as a recording, we hope you can join us at some point down the road too, if you'd like to be in the discussion. I would also like to reach out to some of these theologians and see if I can bring them into this Zoom call so we can begin to get people's insights into this, because I really do believe that our approach to theology, a study of God, is an approach that moves dramatically from the approaches used the last 2,000 years. Theology Without Walls proposes that the subject matter should be ultimate or divine reality, the logos of theos, not one's own tradition. So the question is, can we separate God from one's religion? And of course, that's where we get into the concept of a trans-religious narrative, a trans-religious story. And I will be talking in one of these sessions, either next week or week after, about the biblical narrative as a narrative that has an outcome beyond religion. That I believe firmly that narrative, the biblical narrative, starting with the genesis of human consciousness all the way to what the narrative calls the end, is taking us on a journey that is not restricted. God is not restricted. God doesn't have boundaries. And I want to talk about that in more detail, obviously. Jerry says, we're talking about the ultimate that guides the meaning of our lives and our purpose in the world, the ultimate that defines true north for us. And isn't that what every religion is trying to do? And the reason why I want to talk about Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism, and then hopefully bring some speakers in who are experts in those narratives, is so that we can have what I think are far more fruitful discussions with other religions when we first get a better handle on the biblical narrative and move it out of the walls that have prevented fruitful discussion in the past. That's my opinion. Although Theology Without Walls can be seen as having grown out of comparative theology, its goal is not comparison. It does not share the common assumption that one must be rooted in one's own tradition. So Jerry, again, really pushing hard. Thank you, Jerry Martin, for pushing hard on this. He doesn't want to just have an interfaith dialogue, basically. And I love what he says here. This is a great quote. To treat the world as containing a number of block phenomena called religions is useful for textbooks, but we know it is not quite accurate. It treats religions as more unified, more coherent, unchanging, sharply divined, and impermeable than they really are. And I agree with Jerry. They're within, look, again, going within Christianity. Is Christianity unified? Heavens, no. If Paul were to ask the question today, is Christ divided? I think everyone would say, oh man, big time. But there's a problem with that when it comes to ultimacy, or what the biblical narrative calls God. Paul's question was rhetorical when he asked the question, is Christ divided? Because he knew that was impossible. That when you understand and interpret correctly those things that had been written and taught, you will see that you cannot divide Christ, because Christ was a servant of the reconciliatory work of God. So that's why Paul said to the Corinthians that God was in Christ reconciling the world, universal, to himself or herself itself. God was in Christ doing a world, global, all in all, reconciliatory work. And that's why it's impossible. But as Jerry said, this block phenomenon takes us to our paradigm that we'll be talking about a lot. Block phenomenon, forms. And what will be shared with many other religions that's really not talked about or hasn't been talked about within the biblical narrative is the problem with attachment to form. Attachment to form is one of the main separators and problems, and I want to tease that out. I want to go through it with my infamous Venn diagrams, and I want to show how humanity moves from the realm of form into the realm of that which is formless. So this block phenomenon that Jerry's talking about basically is the problem of form, and form is a real problem because religions are themselves form, and when I attach to a form, I'm going to have a real problem with ultimacy, that which the narrative calls God, and the universal identity that comes with it. So Jerry is explaining here, and I'm going to go into our spiral model here in just a second, that theology, the investigation of the divine reality, has been tethered to religious traditions, their texts, concepts, doctrines, debates, practices, and norms, which have guided theological inquiry. So he concludes, in any case, the bias of theology without walls is in favor of the experience, the encounter, the divine manifestations, not the fixed doctrine of banked tradition. Now, I understand why Dr. Martin is leaning toward one's experience as the way to get beyond the walls. I've talked to people, and so have you all, and you all yourselves have had experiences in your life. And we know that if we have an experience with the divine, with God, that experience is informing us. It's helping us develop a narrative, if you will, a story about our lives. And so if we see that in the biblical narrative, the story is one that is putting up fixed doctrines, and that's the outcome of the story, then the only place you could go to get beyond the walls would be to go through people's different experiences and encounters and divine manifestations. I'm not saying that people don't have experiences. Again, I've talked to charismatic pastors who have come through presence, and we've had a lot of discussions. They've had amazing experiences. I don't deny anybody's experience. What I want to know is, what is the meaning to you of that experience? And when all is said and done about experiences, you will come up with a story, a narrative. So there are many narratives. Some narratives are based on your meaning making of your experiences. So the question then is, what does that inform us about the ultimate, that which the biblical narrative calls God? And is the biblical narrative all about an outcome of a religion that is defined by boundaries, and therefore to adjudicate those boundaries, it must have fixed doctrines, and therefore we would have a bias toward experience, because that seems like walls that we could not get over and walls that we would have a real problem in dealing with. And I'm about to wrap up some of Jerry's comments here. We need to encourage young people especially, but of course not only them, to trust, or at least probe, their most meaningful experiences, to note them, describe their contours, examine their effects, trace out their implications, to see what happens if they act on them. One of the things that theology and theologians and seminaries are recognizing is that the statistics tell us church attendance is dropping. Young people are not finding meaning within the walls of the church building. Young people are not finding meaning within the walls of theology as it has been known. And we're going to talk about why that is the case, because that really is true. I wanted to take a real quick look here at the spiral to, first of all, talk about the last three worldviews that we've been experiencing and how spiral dynamics informs us about a theology without walls and what the nature of those walls have been with regard to Christianity. Because again, we're going to come out of the biblical narrative with a systematic theology that is spiritual but not religious. We're going to come out with a hermeneutical approach that is based on social sciences of worldviews. What are worldviews? Worldviews are simply the way that cultures and societies make meaning of their life conditions. And once they make meaning, then there's certain values that they attach to their society and to their culture. And that's why each level of human history has within it a collective called value memes, value memes. If I take this into the world of theology, those familiar with Paul Tillich know that one of his most famous statement is that which pertains to matters of ultimate concern. What are the matters of ultimate concern to me? And when we go see people going through these worldviews, each worldview will have their matters of ultimate concern. And we will act on our matters of ultimate concern. We'll interpret life based on what we see as our ultimate concerns. In the traditional level in which, and I'll start there because that's pertinent to our theology without walls and going beyond Christianity. When we look at the traditional level, that's where Jesus and the apostles appeared, right in the Roman Empire. And the traditional level brought institution, and it brought with it law, and therefore the introduction for those who came from Israel of the law of Moses. And Jesus and the apostles left the scene, leaving the believers 2,000 years ago with their teachings, but they were looking at those teachings as blue memes, blue value memes. So is it a surprise that you have a Roman Empire that has a Caesar, generals, lieutenants, centurions, and guess what? The interpretation of Jesus and the apostolic writers is, oh, we have then, I guess, a pope and cardinals and bishops and priests. And suddenly we see two male hierarchies, and we see the values are very much centered around law-based obedience to the religion and obedience to the empire. And in the traditional age, you are taught to respect, if not fear, authority, and that whatever you did, you do not question authority. So you do not question the Caesar, nor do you question the Pope or the priest. You are a loyal subject of the empire of Rome, and you are a loyal subject of this new religion that has come called Christianity. And so Christianity is a interpretation, a hermeneutic, if you will, based on the worldview of the people 2,000 years ago after Jesus and the apostolic writers left the scene. That is what they interpreted. That's how they saw it. I might say that each level is like looking through a lens. So in this case, they look through a blue lens. Now, Alexander Pope really kind of gets behind this idea when he writes as a poet that all looks infected, that the infected spy, as all looks yellow to the jaundiced eye. What he's saying is our meaning making is based on our hermeneutic, the way in which we interpret. How do we interpret? In the traditional age, you are interpreting according to those values. And so that is where we would have expected it to start. Now, let me also say that the reason I'm bringing up spiral dynamics is that when you're studying as a theologian, the first thing people note is none of us come to a narrative without presuppositions, that we're all bringing something to the interpretive party. And what I'm saying is that the integral models for integral consciousness, discussions of non-duality and oneness, are the models that we're using, and the presupposition that we come with is that the worldviews have been evolving toward a God who is truly all in all, and therefore the worldviews are coming to a place that for us are very much in sync with the narrative itself. Now, of course, as we all know, this traditional lens had a traditional church for some 1,500 years, but when modernity came, that's when Luther enters, and it's because in modernity, for the first time, people begin to question, and because they question, they also then protest, they deconstruct the form of the Blue Meme world, the form of that church or that Christianity, they protest against it, and boom, once the door is open to questioning, you have all different kinds of Protestant groups, all of which are defining themselves hermeneutically as the church. And so now the question is, who's the true church, the Catholic or the Protestant? And within Protestantism, am I of Wesley? Am I of Calvin? You know, and so those are the ways in which modernity opens up the breakdown of form and the deconstruction of the one form into many forms that are now competing with each other with an outcome called the religion of Christianity. In postmodernity, our most recent worldview, we have moved from the traditional view of one true church, one true form, to postmodernity and what Jerry referenced in one of his quotes of relativism, where the outcome is everybody gets a form. You get a form, you get a form, you get a form. And what that means is that in postmodernity, we are trying to respect everybody's denomination. And further than that, we are trying to respect other people's religion. And this is where the bumper sticker shows up, coexist, in postmodernity. And it's so that we can have interfaith dialogue and interreligious dialogue and comparative theology. And this is the very thing that we've hit the ceiling. It's the very thing that Jerry Martin is challenging theologians to go beyond. Jerry Martin, you see, is saying, okay, this has been our 2,000-year history here. It's with regard to Christianity, of course. And we've come up to postmodernity, but can we not get beyond the walls of the relativized plethora of forms that we now have? Isn't there something more than coexist? Isn't there something more than interfaith dialogue? Isn't there some way we could have an ultimacy define us that goes beyond all of those walls? So one of the things I want to say that will be one of our radical propositions for those that are watching Theology Without Walls here with us is that the biggest wall that's standing today is the wall of Christology. And I'm going to talk about Christology over the next few sessions. Why do I say Christology is the biggest wall that's preventing a theology without walls? Well, first of all, Christianity is the world's largest religion. So you got to give them props that would make their wall the biggest wall. If in fact, the biblical narrative from which we come has a hermeneutic that ends up with a religion. But remember, the history of Christology has not been, as Jerry Martin noted, it hasn't been the same history all the way through. We have had Christology that's been blue, we've had Christology that's been orange, and we have Christology that is green. So the question is Christ consciousness or the mind of Christ blue, orange, or green? What is the mind of Christ? See, all of a sudden we have walls here between us. It's why we have denominations, because to denominate means to separate. And we know that separation is not what we're seeking. We're seeking non-duality and oneness, just the opposite of that. So what if we move into an integral second-tier consciousness? It is here that I'm going to spend my time showing our hermeneutic is an integral hermeneutic. When you go through the narrative and the same data as the traditional modern and postmodernists have, use the same narrative, but use a different hermeneutic, because that's what they did. They said the traditional hermeneutic doesn't work. I'm going to a modern hermeneutic. They said the modern hermeneutic doesn't work. I'm going to a postmodern hermeneutic. We're saying postmodern hermeneutic doesn't work either. We agree with Jerry. So we're going to an integral hermeneutic. What is that? And then what happens with Christology? The movement from traditional to modern and then postmodern Christology is a change of degree. Only a change of degree. Why? Because at the end of traditional, modern, and postmodern, you still end up with a form, a religious form called Christianity. All you're doing is changing the degree by which that form evolves and grows into many, many forms. That's all it is. And so the outcome is the same. And here's the challenge for theologians in seminaries. When you are starting as a Christian theologian, something that's not been said, something that's not been challenged, when you're starting there, you're starting with an assumption. Your assumption as a Christian theologian is that Christianity and Christology was supposed to be a religion to begin with. And if you're a Christian theologian, that means you're starting with that assumption that 2,000 years ago began in the middle of blue traditionalism. We're saying, what if we erase the board and we look at an integral approach? First of all, what is it? Well, I'm going to have a session to talk about that. And if I move into that integral, what is the difference there? And it is there that I say that we're looking at a change of kind. You read articles on the difference between a change of degree versus a change of kind. This is it. This is Theology Without Walls. We have been working in differences of degree. Oh, it's this kind of a church. It's this kind of a church. It's this kind of a church. It's this denomination. It's that denomination. And what we're saying is, what if there's something beyond a Christology that's denominated and ends up as a form-driven religion? So as I look at, and where am I on my time so far? How long have I been going? 42 minutes? Great. Because I've got one more person I want to introduce to you as we set the stage. And I want to talk, as I wrap it up for today, about theology and the spiritual but not religious. This is a group that has been studied in depth by Dr. Linda Mercadante. Danae and I were trying to get up to see Linda in April, but this little thing called the coronavirus kind of got in the way, shut down all travel. Linda was kind enough to offer to meet with us on a Sunday evening, and we weren't able to do it. But I'm hopeful that we'll not only be able to talk to her, possibly get her on some of these Zoom calls. She's author of a book called Belief Without Borders, Inside the Minds of the Spiritual But Not Religious. And she's done a lot of research on SBNR. And I just want to run a couple quotes by you here that Linda has. In a globally challenged, polarized, violence-ridden, climate-endangered world, the tasks we face are so critical, so massive, and so vital to world survival that some common spiritual and social principles are needed. I don't think any of us would disagree with that in order to foster cooperation. It follows that even the SBNRs, the spiritual but not religious, as well as secularists, should understand they benefit from religion. Well, the problem is people are spiritual but not religious because they left religion. They don't want any part of religion. So the question is, how can we bridge or continue to look at conversations that involve spiritual but not religious? Linda says, I found SBNRs, as diverse as they are, to have an impressive agreement on the specific concepts in which they don't believe. Well, this is not unusual. When you move from religion to not religion, you're deconstructing. So we should expect that the early phases of spiritual but not religious are more about what I don't believe. Well, my dad's church believes this, but I don't believe that. My grandfather's church believes this, but I don't believe that. So you do get, with people identifying as spiritual but not religious, a lot of what you don't believe. That makes sense. Linda goes on to quote from Mark Chavez. He has a couple quotes here. He's also looked into this, that the SBNR phenomenon is too vague, unfocused, and anti-institutional for creating stable, socially and politically significant organizational expression. And for the most part, that's where SBNR has been. However, we are proposing a spiritual but not religious outcome to the biblical narrative, the narrative most used by people across the planet. And we're saying that its time has come. By the way, people would say, what are you talking about? How in the world could we have been wrong about the outcome of Christology? Or how in the world could we have misappropriated the biblical narrative in such a way that you're saying, what, that we go post-Christian? Oh, no, that can't even be possible, can it? But by the same token, I would ask that person if they're in a Protestant denomination of any kind or non-denominational church, that who was Martin Luther to stand up after 1,500 years and say, hey, I don't agree with the way religion is structured. And you end up with a whole Protestant movement after the movement had been 1,500 years in the traditional mode. And we're saying it's because change and growth is happening now, just as it always has been. Change and growth aren't new. The specific change and growth that we are proposing is new. So Linda says, although SBNRs are not without an array of guides, at present they're without any agreed upon texts, leaders, or groups. Well, I won't claim to be a leader, but I will say this. We do have for us as a spiritual but not religious outcome the text of the biblical narrative as our data. And as I've already said, that data of the biblical narrative has been interpreted through a blue lens, an orange lens, and a green lens. We're using the same data. We are not throwing any of the data out. We are saying that we are now once again reinterpreting that data just as people have been doing for 2,000 years. Another quote here from Mark Chavez. The SBNR phenomenon is too vague, unfocused, and anti-institutional. What is an institution? An institution is a form. This form has boundaries that the spiritual but not religious do not like. The restrictiveness, this is why Jerry Martin was talking about fixed doctrines versus experience. See, experience is more open. I can have an experience of God and everything is one, and I don't have some board or synod or hierarchy telling me that, no, that's not the way God is. And so the phenomenon today is very vague, very unfocused, spiritual but not religious. I meet people who say they're that, and they're all over the board. However, we are going to give a very focused approach to that. Anti-institutional is, they're anti the form that has been handed down, and that's what they're against. And so I would say that it's time that we quit institutionalizing Jesus. That poor Jesus got put in an institution. He's been institutionalized, and we need to let him go. Linda says it's beyond the scope of this chapter. This is the chapter she can put into the book to determine whether a systematic theology for SBNRs is feasible, much less to develop one. Well, that's why I'm doing this. We have a systematic theology that, as an outcome of spirituality of God, but not a religion. It is beyond religion. And all the way back to good old King Solomon, going through Stephen in Acts chapter 7, and the writer of Hebrews, you find this theme. Nevertheless, God does not dwell in buildings made with hands. God does not dwell within the boundaries of any form. God does not dwell within a specific religion. Well, wait a minute. What are you saying? That you can believe anything, that any religion? No, we're not relativizing. We're also going to have to tease out the difference between identity and role and function. Here we'll see that Christology for 2,000 years has been an identity. But what we're going to do when we go through our theology is to say Christology was never meant to be an identity. Christology was meant to be in the category of role and function, and we're going to show our Venn diagrams and other things that that bear that out. So, okay, if you're still awake, those of you who have joined me live, and you enjoyed your lunch, Dave had his lunch. I'm glad Dave enjoyed his lunch. I spewed quite a bit there to do what? It's to say, first of all, if you're watching this recording and you're part of the Theology Without Walls movement, we hear you. We at Presence hear all of you who have the courage to ask the question, can we pursue a theology outside the walls of our particular religion? This is exactly what Presence has been doing very strongly, really, for the last 20 years since we started using integral model and applying those integral models to the narrative and asking the question, isn't it time for us to continue to challenge the hermeneutics that we've used? And isn't it time for us to see if God isn't a lot bigger than we have been thinking? If God is not also in all, meaning that if we use a hermeneutic that takes us from form to transform the formless, which I'll get into next time, that we might find that we have other conversations with Buddhists and Hindus and Taoists that almost make it sound like God is in all people. Like it could even sound like, oh my goodness, the Spirit of God is in people in Asia and in the East, just like the Spirit of God is in the West. And do so without in any way, shape, or form having an effect on my faith in the God who is revealed and the way that God is revealed in the biblical narrative. That's the challenge of the conversation we want. For those of you that used to be in a fundamentalist church, just remember you changed your mind. and you found the walls of that fundamentalist church too restrictive. That is what we're going to ask again. Can we look at the way we have interpreted Christology as being too restrictive and putting up too many walls between us and other people? And if so, how can we be true to that narrative on the one hand from which we come, and on the other hand, open up the door for a conversation beyond the walls of Christology as a religion? So that's where I'm going to go. I appreciate everybody who has joined us for this particular recording, and I'll look forward to picking it up and going from there next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.